On a drab Monday that promised drizzle and failed even at that, the parish bulletin board outside St. Botolph's Church presented its usual tidy clutter of faded notices. Harvest supper volunteers, lost cat, again, and the vicar's gently admonishing line about punctuality at choir practice. What was not usual was the empty space below a small brass hook, where the curate's bicycle and elderly rally, with more patches than paint, had leaned since anyone could remember. Mrs. Chubb, who kept the post office and the post office gossip in equal order, was the first to mention it. She remarked to the milkman that the Lord's servant seems to have mislaid his means of transport. By the time the milkman reached the butcher's, it had become a tale of a daring daylight theft by outsiders, possibly from Granby. And by the time the butcher's assistant repeated it to his sweetheart behind the haberdashery counter, the curate himself was suspected of having sold the machine to fund an urgent missionary cause of a personal nature. The curate in question, Reverend Simon Felsham, could not have looked less like a man engaged in scandal. He was pink about the cheeks, earnest about the soul, and only slightly uncertain about sermons. Yet his disappearance on foot that morning, seen trudging along the high street with his cassock flapping like a mishoisted flag, fed a sort of moral excitement rare in the town of Flaxborough. Even the town hall clock seemed to tick with curiosity. At 11:30, Inspector Purbright looked up from a report on municipal vandalism, the theft of a park bench plank, when Sergeant Love entered bearing that expression of respectful alarm that usually presaged something both trivial and public. "Morning, sir." The vicar rang up. "Seems the curate's bicycle's been pinched." Purbright removed his spectacles, polished them on a handkerchief that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and said, "Do we know in which order the bicycle and the curate departed?" "Bicycle first, sir." Curate followed on foot. "Then at least we can be sure the Lord moves in mysterious cycles," murmured Purbright, sliding the spectacles back on. "Very well, love, let us take a little stroll to St. Botolph's before the press gets there. One can rely on them to magnify a tricycle into organised crime." The churchyard, when they arrived, exuded a peace more botanical than spiritual. The vicar, Canon Simper, met them beside the empty hook, his expression one of genteel outrage. "Inspector, it is not the value, of course it is the symbolism, a servant of the church deprived of his conveyance." "Indeed," said Purbright, almost scriptural in its way. The curate appeared from the vestry, cassock slightly mud-spattered, explaining that he had only left the bicycle for a few minutes while delivering leaflets. No one had seen a thing, except perhaps Mrs. Trindle, who was certain she had observed a suspicious gentleman of middle height loitering near the notice board, but then she had also recently reported a suspicious gentleman in the mirror of her own hallway. Purbright examined the patch of gravel where the bicycle had stood, noting little except two faint tyre tracks leading not to the gate but across the grass toward the lane behind the church hall. "Unorthodox exit," he murmured. "Our thief is either irreverent or late for matins." The interview with the parish staff revealed nothing except a subtle discomfort whenever the curate's name was mentioned. The organist hinted at disagreements about modern hymns. The churchwarden muttered about unpaid subscriptions to the cycling club. Even the flower-arranging ladies shared a look, suggesting some private amusement. Small towns, Purbright reflected, never truly conceal their laughter. They merely lower its volume. By late afternoon, the news had reached every tea table in Flaxborough. The curate's missing bicycle became the day's moral weather. Everyone felt obliged to comment upon it, though no one quite understood why. At the police station, Sergeant Love compiled a list of possible sightings ranging from a boy on a red bicycle near allotments to a nun on a moped who looked guilty. Purbright read it with the tolerant patience of a man accustomed to confusion in alphabetical order. That evening, as rain finally decided to justify the morning's threat, Purbright stood by the window of his office watching puddles gather in the courtyard. "Love," he said without turning, "a stolen bicycle is seldom about the bicycle. Let's keep an eye on who profits by its absence." The sergeant frowned. "Profit, sir? Reputation, advantage, revenge. Profit takes many forms in small economies." He smiled faintly. "We shall start, I think, with those who disliked the curate's hymns." Outside, the church bell struck 6, sounding oddly muffled as though somewhere nearby a wheel had begun to turn. By Tuesday morning, the curate's bicycle had achieved a sort of sainthood through repetition. Every shop bell that rang in Flaxborough seemed to toll for it. The town, being rich in opinions but short on incidents, clutched this one like a collective hobby. The postmistress had revised her original theory of theft by outsiders and now favoured the notion of a young rascal from the grammar school. The grammar school, in turn, privately suspected the parish choir boys, while the choir boys themselves preferred to accuse the paper boys, whose guilt required no evidence beyond their general dishevelment. Inspector Purbright, who found gossip a more reliable diagnostic than evidence in such places, spent the morning strolling through the market square with Sergeant Love at his side. The drizzle of the previous night had left the cobbles shining like sensible shoes, and the townsfolk were out in their usual half-hearted bustle. A new poster outside the Corn Exchange advertised a forthcoming lecture on moral fortitude in municipal planning, which Purbright considered a contradiction in terms. Their first stop was the bicycle repair shop, a narrow, oil-scented cavern presided over by Mr. Cribbin, a man whose spectacles were so thick they gave his eyes the appearance of tropical fish. He greeted Purbright with the relish of someone certain that any event worth the police's attention would sooner or later involve him. "Morning, Inspector. You're after that church contraption, I suppose. I've heard of it 3 times this morning already." "Then I'm already behind," said Purbright pleasantly. "Has anyone tried to sell you a second-hand rally of late ecclesiastical appearance?" Cribbin chuckled. "Not unless it's developed wings, sir. I've seen none of it. Though," he added with a squint, "a gentleman from the next parish came in yesterday asking for a replacement bell, claimed his old one, lost its tone." "Strange choice of words, that." Purbright made a note. "Name?" "Didn't give it. Middle-aged grey Mac, manners like vinegar." Outside, Sergeant Love remarked, "Perhaps the thief dismantled it." "Possibly," Purbright replied, "though I doubt any sinner so industrious would confine himself to bicycles." They continued toward the High Street, passing Mrs. Trindle's window where a new display of knitted tea cosies had appeared overnight, each tagged with a price, though none likely to be paid. Mrs. Trindle herself emerged, eager as an evangelist of trivia. "Inspector, I've remembered something. The man I saw by the church notice board had mud on his shoes, thick mud. I noticed because he scuffed it on the pavement." "Was it perhaps raining at the time?" Purbright asked gently. She paused, brow furrowed by the effort of coherence. "Well, yes, but this was different mud. Country mud. Determined mud. Indeed. Thank you, Mrs. Trindle. We shall alert the countryside." As they left, Love risked a grin. "Determined mud, sir? I dare say it will lead us somewhere," said Purbright, "if only to a better understanding of Mrs. Trindle." By midday, the constabulary had received 3 anonymous tips, one alleging the bicycle had been seen leaning outside the public library, waiting for its owner, another suggesting it had been thrown into the canal, symbolically perhaps, and a third hinting that it might have been hidden behind the cricket pavilion for reasons best known to Providence. Purbright regarded each report as a small portrait of its author rather than of the facts. He sent Love to check the pavilion anyway, on the grounds that Providence occasionally obliged. When Love returned, damp but triumphant, he carried not the bicycle but a clue of sorts, a torn corner of a hymn sheet, soggy and dirt-streaked, found near the pavilion hedge. The words still visible were "Led kindly light," which struck Purbright as either irony or coincidence, depending on the writer's humour. That afternoon brought a visit from Mrs. Hopgood, the vicar's wife, a stately woman with a gaze that could curdle curates. She arrived at the police station, armed with a moral certainty that the matter required swift and public rectification. "The reputation of St. Botolph's," she declared, "is at stake, Inspector. People are whispering about impropriety, about debt. I need hardly say how damaging that can be." Purbright nodded solemnly. "Of course, madam. In my experience, whispering is usually loudest from those who started it." She ignored the remark. "Simon Mr. Felsham is a good young man, but he is impressionable. He keeps curious company." "Indeed? Of what sort?" "Charitable women, Inspector, the sort who give too much time and perhaps too much sympathy to the clergy. Miss Larton, for instance, leads the youth fellowship, always cycling after dark." The implication hovered delicately like incense after a high mass. When she had gone, Purbright gazed thoughtfully at the door. "A curate's bicycle and a curate's admirer, love. I wonder which is more likely to have been borrowed without permission." Love hesitated. "You think she might have taken it, sir?" "I think human impulses require less logic than opportunity," said Purbright. "And Miss Larton seems to have both." He decided to call upon her that evening. Miss Larton lived in a semi-detached cottage behind the grammar school, its front garden crowded with sunflowers as though compensating for the modesty of the house. She received Purbright with nervous brightness, her hands twisting a tea towel into increasingly theological shapes. "Oh, Inspector, such a dreadful thing. Poor Mr. Felsham must be so embarrassed. I can't imagine anyone wanting his bicycle. It was hardly elegant." "Utility before elegance," Purbright observed. "Have you seen it recently?" "Only on Sunday evening." He cycled past Evensong, ringing his bell in that cheerful way. "I remember because, well, he waved, and since then—" "No," she coloured faintly, "though I did notice muddy tracks near the hedge on Monday morning. I thought perhaps children." Purbright asked a few more polite questions, noting that her bicycle, a newer model, stood by the door with a clean chain and neatly oiled pedals. It did not, he reflected, look as though it had been out in determined mud. As he walked back toward the station, the evening air held a promise of rain again, and the faint smell of wet stone that always preceded it. The gas lamps were just beginning to bloom in the dusk, halos of yellow gentility over a town perpetually on the verge of scandal, yet never quite reaching it. Purbright found the rhythm comforting. In Flaxborough, moral outrage was a kind of recreation, only rarely did it conceal genuine malice. Back at his desk, he studied the hymn fragment laid out to dry on blotting paper. Its edges suggested it had been torn hastily, perhaps used to wrap something or mark a page. The ink had bled where rain had touched it. He turned it over, seeing faint smudges that might once have been fingerprints, though not distinct enough for proof. He leaned back, hands clasped behind his head. "Love," he said, "let us presume for the moment that our missing machine was not stolen for profit." "Then for what, sir?" "Perhaps to prevent someone being seen using it or to remove something attached to it. Locks, baskets, even notes, tucked under saddles, have been known to start scandals." Love blinked. "You think there's a note involved?" "I think," said Purbright, "that bicycles rarely vanish for theological reasons. Let's find out who last spoke to the curate before Sunday evening and whether his sermons have lately improved." The sergeant left with a puzzled nod, and Purbright allowed himself a small smile. Outside, thunder rolled gently beyond the meadows, as if the weather itself were rehearsing for confession. Somewhere, In the darkness, a wheel might yet be turning slowly, politely, and in a most unholy direction. The following morning began with a sort of purposeful stillness that always settled over the police station after gossip had run its first lap around the town. Flaxborough, having exhausted speculation, now waited politely for someone in authority to provide facts, preferably ones worth disproving. Inspector Purbright, finding his tea tepid, but his mind alert, reviewed the previous day's notes. The curate's bicycle, though trivial in value, had rippled across the community in a way that hinted at something knotted beneath the surface. Few objects, he mused, inspired both pity and suspicion at once. Sergeant Love appeared with his usual expression of optimism, lightly dusted with confusion. "Morning, sir. I've got statements from the choir boys, the verger, and the newsagent, who swears he saw a man wheeling a bicycle toward the canal about 6 o'clock Sunday evening." Purbright glanced up. "And did our newsagent happen to notice that it was the curate's machine and not, say, his own?" "Not exactly, sir. He says it looked clerical." "Clerical?" "Yes, sir. Black frame, worn saddle, air of resignation." Purbright smiled faintly. A fair description of many bicycles in Flaxborough, and not a few clergymen. He stood, brushing a few tobacco flakes from his coat. "Let's call on Reverend Felsham again. It's always instructive to revisit a man after the town has had a day to discuss him." They found the curate in the vicarage garden, attempting to prune a rose bush while simultaneously apologizing to it. His face brightened, though with the nervousness of one accustomed to guilt by proximity. "Inspector, have you found it?" "Not yet," Purbright said mildly. "We're collecting impressions for the moment. The town is generous with them." The curate sighed. "I do wish they wouldn't fuss so much. It's only a bicycle." "Indeed," said Purbright, "and yet, in Flaxborough, the theft of a bicycle can easily become a referendum on character. Tell me, when did you last use it?" "Sunday afternoon. I rode out to Mrs. Hurtle's farm beyond the common. She'd asked me to bless her new calf. I left just before evensong. Did you go alone?" The curate hesitated, pruners poised mid-air. "Well, yes, though I did stop at Miss Larton's on the way back. She'd promised to lend me some hymn books." "Ah, so she mentioned," Purbright said, watching him carefully. "And did she seem to put it uneasy?" Felsham coloured. "Not at all, though she did say someone had been watching her house lately. She thought it might be one of the schoolboys." "Did she describe this observer?" "No. She seemed embarrassed. I fear she imagines attention where there is none." Purbright thanked him, glanced once more at the mutilated rose bush, and took his leave. "In the lane outside," Love said. "He's hiding something, sir." "Concealing or merely avoiding embarrassment, Love? The two are cousins, often mistaken for twins." He looked down the road where a milk cart trundled past, the horse steaming gently in the morning sun. "Still, it's worth noting that both Curate and Miss Larton mentioned the hedge. Perhaps our mud had company. They made their next call at the library, a building whose stone frontage conferred moral superiority upon its rather dusty contents. Mrs. Bellman, the librarian, was as thin and precise as her cataloguing system. She greeted Purbright with the faint impatience of a woman whose shelves did not require police supervision. "I understand," said Purbright, "that a bicycle was seen outside your building Sunday evening." Mrs. Bellman sniffed. "Several, I imagine." "Sunday sermons drive many to literature of a penitential sort?" "Romantic, mostly. The curate himself borrowed A Modern Theology of Forgiveness last week. I returned it rather too promptly, I thought." Purbright glanced around. "Did anyone else borrow something the same day?" She consulted a card file with ceremonial gravity. "Miss Larton, a short history of chastity?" Rather more of a challenge to return quickly. The inspector inclined his head in gratitude. "You have a gift for titles, Mrs. Bellman." Outside, Love struggled to contain amusement. You think there's more between the curate and that lady, sir? There's always more between people than they admit, Purbright replied. Whether it's affection, irritation, or theology remains to be seen. By afternoon, rain threatened again, gathering in quiet drifts across the rooftops. Purbright and Love returned to the church to examine the grounds once more. This time, Purbright knelt by the hedge near the notice board, where faint marks on the gravel suggested a bicycle had been turned sharply, perhaps wheeled in haste. A scrap of twine lay caught among the roots, frayed and muddy. Could have been used for tying something down, Love suggested. Or for carrying something off, said Purbright. Bag, basket, anything that needed discretion. Inside the vestry they found the vicar engaged in an argument with the organist over the choice of hymns for the upcoming harvest festival. Both fell silent when Purbright entered, adopting expressions of instant righteousness. "Gentlemen," Purbright said pleasantly, "I'm merely curious. Did either of you see Reverend Felsham's Sunday evening after evensong?" The organist spoke first. "I saw him talking to that young woman from the Fellowship Larton, near the church gate. Nothing improper, of course, though they seemed rather absorbed." The vicar sighed. "Inspector, I'm sure there's no cause for insinuation. Simon is a decent man indeed. Still, the truth is often a modest creature. It prefers to be fetched rather than assumed." Purbright thanked them and left before either could summon further outrage. That evening, the inspector walked home through the drizzle, umbrella tilted against the low wind. Flaxborough glowed faintly under its lamps, the shop windows shutting one by one, like polite eyelids. The day's conversations played through his mind: mud by the hedge, a hymn torn and wet, a borrowed book on chastity, and a lady convinced of unseen watchers. The pattern was delicate but definite. If the bicycle had indeed been stolen to conceal something, then it was not mere jealousy, it was secrecy's nervous child. At home, he opened a small notebook and drew two neat columns. On the left, he listed Curate Felsham, Miss Larton, Canon Simper, Mrs. Hopgood, Mrs. Trindle. On the right, a single heading, Motive. He filled none of it in. Sometimes the absence of ink was more instructive than its presence. The following day brought the first true development. Sergeant Love, returning from an errand, placed a damp paper bag on Purbright's desk. Inside lay a small bicycle lamp, its glass cracked, its base speckled with dried mud. "Found it behind the cricket pavilion, sir. Same place as that hymn sheet." Purbright turned it over thoughtfully. "No sign of rust on the battery contacts. It hasn't been there long. The thief or borrower was careful, but not enough to tidy up." "Could have fallen off when they lifted it over the hedge," Love suggested. "Possibly." Purbright set it down, eyes distant. "But I suspect whoever took that bicycle needed light for reasons other than safety." Love frowned. "You mean night riding?" "Night visiting," said Purbright softly. "And someone, somewhere, didn't wish it to be known." The sergeant stared. "You think this is about an affair, sir? I think it's about appearances, and in Flaxborough, that is a far graver sin." Purbright rose, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. "Tomorrow, Love, we'll talk to the choir boys again. Children remember what adults try to forget." Outside, thunder grumbled distantly once more. Somewhere in the wet hush of the town, wheels might still turn, carrying not just a missing bicycle, but the uneasy weight of what the town preferred not to see. The morning after the bicycle lamp's discovery began with a thin fog hanging over Flaxborough, like unspoken guilt. The town looked slightly blurred, as if it had been drawn with a pencil and someone had tried to smudge the lines. Inside the police station, Sergeant Love poured himself a second cup of tea, pretending not to notice that. Purbright's was already cold. The inspector had been sitting at his desk for nearly an hour, chin resting on one hand, staring thoughtfully at the cracked lamp that glimmered faintly under the office light. "There's something almost devotional about it," Purbright murmured, "like a votive offering left behind at the scene of temptation." Love frowned. "You think the curate left it there himself, sir?" "I am thinking," said Purbright slowly, "that the bicycle's disappearance achieved something beyond inconvenience. It's already washed his reputation quite clean. The town has stopped laughing and started sympathizing." The sergeant's eyes widened. "You mean someone might have taken it to help him? Or to rescue him from embarrassment, debt, or discovery? The form of charity most practiced in Flaxborough is concealment." Before Love could reply, a tap came at the door. It was Constable Keynes, earnest and perpetually surprised by his own duties. "Sir, there's a Mr. Larton here, Miss Larton's father. Says he wants a word about the curate's business." Purbright gestured to let him in. Mr. Larton proved to be a red-faced man of vigorous self-importance, his waistcoat straining against convictions long since hardened. "Inspector," he announced, "I've come to put an end to this whispering. My daughter's good name is being dragged through every teapot in the parish." Purbright rose courteously. "I assure you, Mr. Larton, we've dragged nothing and steeped even less. But I'm always glad of information. She's a respectable girl," Larton continued, ignoring the comment. "Church work, charity, Sunday schools a lot. If she's been seen speaking to that curate after dark, it was out of concern for his soul, not her own." Purbright inclined his head. "I quite believe it. And yet, good intentions are often the first to be misunderstood. Tell me, did she mention her bicycle missing recently?" Larton blinked. "No, but it was gone from the shed Monday morning. She said she'd lent it to a friend. I thought nothing of it." Purbright exchanged a glance with Love. "Did she say which friend?" "No, I assumed one of the fellowship girls." "But if you're suggesting she's mixed up in this nonsense, well, I'll not have it." "I'm not suggesting," said Purbright calmly. "I'm merely listening. It's an underrated art." He thanked the man who left muttering about slander and sermons. As the door closed, Purbright smiled thinly. "There, Love, we've found our first suspect by the father's own defence." Love looked uncertain. "You think Miss Larton took the curate's bicycle and hid it?" "I think she may have taken him to prevent him using hers. A subtle distinction, but useful." They decided to pay her another visit. The afternoon was cool and damp, the kind of weather that encouraged honesty through sheer discomfort. Miss Larton received them at her door, looking pale but composed. Her cottage smelled faintly of furniture polish and tension. "Inspector," she said, "I hoped this would all be over. Have you found Mr. Felsham's bicycle?" "Not yet," said Purbright, stepping inside. "But we found a lamp behind the cricket pavilion. Not unlike the one that used to be on his handlebars." Her hands tightened on the edge of her cardigan. "I wouldn't know anything about that." "Of course," Purbright said, his tone gentle. "Though your father mentioned that your own bicycle was missing on Monday morning." She bit her lip. "It isn't missing. I lent it to a friend." "Mr. Felsham?" Her silence lengthened until it resembled confession. "He needed to visit someone," she said at last, voice low. "Someone outside the parish. He asked if he might borrow mine just for the evening. He said his own chain had broken." "And did you see him afterward?" "No. I waited, but he didn't come back that night. The next morning, my bicycle was behind the hedge, muddy, but otherwise fine." Purbright studied her carefully. "Miss Larton, did he tell you who he was visiting?" She shook her head, only that it was a delicate matter, something he couldn't discuss. "I thought perhaps a parishioner was in trouble. I'm sure that's what he told you." Purbright smiled with a kind of weary kindness. "Thank you. That's been most helpful." When they left, Love muttered, "So the curate borrowed hers, but then his own disappeared the next day. Could be a coincidence." "In Flaxborough," said Purbright. "Coincidence is just the polite alias for arrangement." They walked back toward the churchyard, where the fog still lingered in damp folds. Purbright paused by the hedge again, gazing at the twin ruts where tyres had pressed into the earth. "Love," he said softly, "one set of marks goes out and doesn't return. The other comes in and stops short. We may have 2 bicycles here and only one honest account." Love crouched beside the tracks. "So Miss Larton's was used Sunday night, and the curate's was taken later?" "Possibly by someone who saw him at the church Monday morning and decided it was an opportunity, or by someone who wished to remove the evidence of its absence the night before." The sergeant rubbed his head. "That sounds complicated." "It usually does," said Purbright. "Truth, when it finally speaks, often sounds like an afterthought." That evening, the vicar telephoned the station, his voice strained between indignation and embarrassment. "Inspector, I feel obliged to tell you Simon, our curate, has resigned. He left a note saying he must answer to higher authority." "I'm sure he only means reflection, but still it's most inconvenient." Purbright thanked him and hung up slowly. "Well, love," he said, "our bicycle may have rolled farther than we thought. A man resigning before being accused is as telling as a thief returning before he's missed. Do we arrest him, sir?" Purbright shook his head. "Not yet. Let the town do its bit of sermonizing first. We shall see who feels relieved." By next morning, word of the curate's sudden resignation had reached every breakfast table in Flaxborough. The butcher's wife declared it proof of guilt. The draper's assistant saw it as heartbreak. Even Mrs. Trindle claimed to have dreamt the whole thing, though she provided no witnesses. When Purbright arrived at the church again, he found Canon Simper and Mrs. Hopgood in whispered conference near the font, pausing guiltily when they saw him. "I take it," said Purbright, "that the parish intends to forgive its curate after proper consideration." Mrs. Hopgood sniffed. "Forgiveness, Inspector, requires repentance. So far we have only disappeared." "Disappearance," Purbright observed, "is sometimes the most sincere form of repentance." He walked slowly through the nave, his footsteps hollow against the tiles. Something about the quiet air of virtue made him uneasy. Outside, Love was waiting with an update. "Sir, we've checked the pawn shops. No sign of a sale. But one of the railway porters says a man in clerical coat took a train north last night with a bicycle ticketed to Granby." Purbright's brow lifted slightly. "Ah, so the prodigal has taken the wheels and gone. That will satisfy everyone for now." Love frowned. "So he really stole it then?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps someone wanted him to look as though he had." Purbright turned toward the railway line that shimmered faintly through the mist. "Either way, love, we now have a convenient sinner, which means the real story can begin." He stood there for a long moment, the whistle of a distant train slicing through the fog like a benediction turned inside out. Behind them, the church bell tolled for morning prayers, each note echoing the same quiet absurdity, that in Flaxborough faith and folly often rode the same bicycle, though seldom in the same direction. Inspector Purbright always distrusted conclusions that arrived too early. They tended to be like trains in fog, pleasingly audible, but headed somewhere else. The curate's apparent flight, bicycle in tow, was precisely that sort of premature arrival. Everyone in Flaxborough had seized upon it as the end of the story, which naturally persuaded Purbright it was only the middle. The morning brought sunshine that felt almost intrusive after so much moral cloud. The market square was busy again, conversations renewed with fresh certainty about the curate's downfall. Purbright and Sergeant Love walked through it slowly, collecting fragments of opinion like stray receipts. A group of pensioners outside the bakery were arguing about whether the curate had absconded to France, or to Lincoln at least. Foreign either way, one woman decided. They eat salad there. Love looked troubled. If he really did go north, sir, we could contact the Granby police. They'll check the station. Purbright nodded absently. Do that, but ask them to confirm the ticket seller's memory first. Clerical coats have a way of multiplying in railway stations. As Love went off to make the call, Purbright strolled toward the churchyard again. The grass was drying, the gravel underfoot sharp with light. He paused near the hedge where the bicycles had last been seen. A robin, fat and cheerful, hopped along the fence as if supervising. Purbright smiled at it, then noticed something half buried near the roots of the yew tree. Bending down, he lifted a small strip of metal, no longer than a finger, twisted and rust-speckled. A tag, it seemed, from a luggage clasp. On its underside, faint but legible, were two engraved letters. S.F. Simon Felsham, he murmured. The curate's initials. The object itself was trivial, yet its position nowhere near the church gate or the path was not. Someone had dropped it while carrying something heavier, perhaps a bag fastened by such a clasp, a bag worth concealing. Back at the station, Love returned from his telephone expedition looking puzzled. Granby police say no one matching the curate's description arrived. They checked all the trains. There was a ticket sold for a bicycle, but it was never claimed, just left at the station. Abandoned appearances, Purbright said quietly. How very pious. He placed the metal tag on his blotter. Love, I suspect our curate went nowhere, or rather that someone went to considerable trouble to make it look as if he had. But who'd bother? Someone who needed him was absent without question. Purbright tapped the desk lightly. Let's consider our possibilities. The vicar was too concerned with reputation to risk direct scandal. Mrs. Hopgood ambitious, protective, and not unacquainted with righteous cruelty. Miss Larton is devoted, frightened, and perhaps capable of folly for love's sake. Each could gain something from removing the curate or from sparing him public humiliation. Love frowned. You think he's still here, sir? I think he's closer than anyone supposes. The day unfolded gently, as days in Flaxborough always did, before turning peculiar. At noon, Mrs. Trindle appeared at the police station with news of great importance. Inspector, you may not believe me, she began, but I've seen the curate's bicycle well, I think it's his. Black, with one handlebar lower than the other, just like the one in the photograph on the notice board. Purbright resisted the urge to point out that there was no such photograph. Where exactly, Mrs. Trindle? Behind the old rectory wall near the compost heap. My niece was taking scraps for the hens and saw the wheel sticking out. It looked very improper. 10 minutes later, Purbright and Love were standing behind the disused rectory, peering into a tangle of nettles and ivy. There it was, a black rally, mud-caked and lopsided, its chain missing. The frame was indeed clerical, as Love had once called it, black, humble, exhausted. Purbright brushed away a layer of dried leaves and found the remains of a paper label still attached to the rear mudguard. On it, in smudged ink, someone had written, "For the harvest." I love reading it aloud. For the harvest? What's that supposed to mean? Symbolism, said Purbright dryly, always fatal to logic, but perhaps not to evidence. They wheeled the bicycle out carefully and carried it back to the station for examination. The chain had been cut cleanly, not broken. The tires still held air. A small canvas satchel hung from the handlebar. Inside were a notebook, a handkerchief, and a folded leaflet titled The Parish Aid Society Annual Report. The report was unremarkable until Purbright noticed that one page listing the Society's donations had been carefully torn out. "Love," he said, "we may be moving from missing property to creative bookkeeping. Fraud, sir, or extortion, or mere embarrassment. In Flaxborough, moral virtue often travels with missing receipts." He sent the bicycle to be dusted for prints, though he doubted the result. The metal tag, however, he kept on his desk. By late afternoon, confirmation arrived from Granby that the bicycle ticket had been purchased not by a clergyman, but by a lady in a blue hat and gloves. No one had questioned her. She had been polite, middle-aged, and unmemorable. Purbright looked at the report and said quietly, "Mrs. Hopgood owns a blue hat and a formidable sense of civic duty." Love blinked. "You think she planted the story about the curate running away?" "Or ensured the appearance of his flight," said Purbright. "She spoke of protecting the church's reputation. Perhaps she believed removing him would achieve precisely that. A curate's disappearance is less scandalous than a curate's disgrace, but why hide the bicycle then? To keep the lie tidy, love. Tidy lies are a Flaxborough tradition." That evening, Purbright paid a discreet visit to the vicarage. The vicar was out attending a diocesan committee meeting, but Mrs. Hopgood received him in the parlour with her usual posture of offended dignity. "Inspector," she said, "if this is about that unfortunate young man, I assure you we've heard nothing. My husband is deeply wounded by his betrayal." Purbright's tone was mild. "I wonder, madam, whether betrayal always takes the form of departure. Sometimes it looks rather like obedience." She frowned. "I don't follow." He drew from his pocket the small metal tag and placed it on the table. "Recognize it?" Her expression did not change, but her fingers tightened around her teacup. "Should I?" It came from a bag belonging to Reverend Felsham. "The same bag that I suspect contained some awkward papers. The sort of papers that might explain why certain church funds were unaccounted for." "That's absurd," she said sharply. "My husband manages those matters." "Indeed," said Purbright softly, "which makes one wonder whose reputation truly required saving." She stood abruptly, colour rising. "Inspector, this conversation is impertinent." "Undoubtedly," he said, pocketing the tag again, "and yet useful." He left her standing by the hearth, anger flickering like gaslight behind the calm facade. Outside, he paused beneath the vicarage yew tree, thinking. The curate's resignation, the lady at Granby with the bicycle ticket, the missing donations page, each detail, trivial on its own, now aligned like spokes around an unseen hub. Somewhere at the centre, the curate waited silent, complicit, or afraid. The evening bells began to ring again across the town, echoing over the rooftops in patient rhythm. Purbright listened, head tilted, as though the notes themselves might confess. Then he smiled faintly. "Love," he murmured to the air, "we've been riding in circles. Time to see who's pushing the pedals." By midweek, the curate's absence had settled into the rhythm of an accepted scandal. The townspeople, having wrung it dry of surprise, were beginning to fold it neatly into an anecdote. In the tea shop, Mrs. Chubb declared that she'd always thought him too good-looking for sermons. The chemist's assistant proposed he had eloped with a nun. The truth, meanwhile, waited patiently for Inspector Purbright, who preferred his mysteries unripe until he'd tested their flavour. That afternoon, he sat in his office with the recovered bicycle before him. It looked no more eloquent than any other inanimate witness, but Purbright had long learned that objects often told the truth by what they failed to conceal. His fingers traced the mud-encrusted frame, stopping on the rear mudguard where the faint label for the harvest still clung. The handwriting was neat, clerical, perhaps female. It was an odd phrase, half moral, half agricultural, a slogan with more piety than purpose. Sergeant Love entered with a folder of notes. "We've checked the Parish Aid Society records, sir." "You were right, there's a page missing from the accounts. The one listing private donations. Mrs. Hopgood says it must have been lost when they compiled last year's report." "Of course she does," Purbright murmured. "Lost pages are the safest kind. No one expects them to be found." He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. "Still, it means the curate might have discovered something inconvenient. Perhaps he asked too many questions. About the missing money? Possibly. Or about who was giving it." The remark hung between them like a riddle, too impolite to answer. Then Purbright rose, coat already in hand. "Let's take a walk, love. I've a fancy for parish records and fresh air." They crossed the churchyard once more, the air cool and faintly metallic with autumn. Inside the vestry, the vicar was absent, but the organist, a nervous man named Pell, was practicing scales that sounded like arguments. When Purbright asked about the missing page, Pell's fingers faltered mid-octave. "Oh, I wouldn't know anything about that," he said quickly. "Mrs. Hopgood handles all the funds. She's terribly careful, won't let anyone else near the ledgers." Purbright nodded mildly. "And yet something near them seems to have gone astray." "Well, yes," Pell admitted, "but she says it was only a small clerical error." "Clerical," Purbright repeated softly, with a flicker of amusement. "That's an adaptable word." After they left, Love said, "He's frightened of her." "So is most of the parish," Purbright replied, "which is why she makes an excellent guardian of secrets." They continued along the lane toward the allotments behind the church hall. The path was still marked with faint bicycle tracks, though rain had blurred their edges. Purbright stopped beside a shed stacked with sacks of compost and old hymn books. Something white glimmered near the door. He bent down and picked up a folded envelope, slightly damp but sealed. Across the front, written in that same neat clerical hand, were the words, "For Mrs. Hopgood, private." He turned it over thoughtfully but made no move to open it. "Curious," he said. "Abandoned mail seldom arrives by bicycle accident." Love looked nervous. "Should we look inside?" Purbright slipped it into his pocket. "Not yet. Temptation is best postponed until it feels respectable." They walked back through the market square, where the newsagent was changing his window display from seaside postcards to moral tracts. When Purbright paused, the man greeted him cheerfully. "Terrible business about that curate, sir. They say he's fled the country." "Which country exactly?" "Oh, anywhere. Places with looser morals." He winked. Still, Mrs. Hopgood took it very calmly. A remarkable woman, that one. Paid off his outstanding printing bills herself, so the parish wouldn't suffer embarrassment. Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Generous indeed. Did she say why?" "She said she believed in forgiving debts, Inspector. Though between us, she didn't sound entirely forgiving." When they returned to the station, Purbright placed the unopened envelope beside the bicycle lamp. Two small tokens of what he privately called Flaxborough's devotions, each revealing as much about faith as about crime. He poured himself a cup of tea, then finally broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper, written in a hand that trembled slightly, but carried moral precision. "Dear Mrs. Hopgood, I fear I can no longer cooperate with what you call the arrangement. I cannot sign the new report knowing the figures are untrue. I shall speak to the canon tomorrow and explain that the extra funds never reached the Society's accounts. I have kept copies of the correspondence, as you advised, though I doubt you meant me to keep them for this purpose. If I am mistaken, forgive me, but conscience leaves no room for delay. Yours sincerely, Simon Felsham." Purbright read it twice, then folded it neatly. "Well, love," he said, "our curate was not fleeing sin, but confession." The sergeant frowned. "Then what happened to him, sir? If he meant to tell the vicar, why vanish?" "Because someone thought repentance contagious," Purbright said. and acted before it could spread. Evening brought with it another kind of quiet hush of speculation, running thin. Purbright, walking home past the shop fronts, noticed that people nodded more cautiously now, as though afraid he might be carrying questions in his pockets. At the corner by the library, he met Mrs. Bellman, who lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Inspector, I don't wish to intrude, but that young Miss Larton, she's been in twice today, asking for books on foreign missions. I believe she plans to leave Flaxborough." Purbright thanked her and continued on. The wind had begun to pick up, scattering leaves across the cobbles. A single lamplight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move just a little too deliberately. When he reached his own gate, Love was waiting with another report. "Sir, one of the church hall cleaners found a bag this evening, stuffed under the stage, behind the old curtains." "What kind of bag?" "Leather, small, initials SF, inside. Empty except for a few torn receipts." Purbright took it, examining the clasp. The missing tag would have fit perfectly on its corner. "So that's where our curate dropped his conscience." "Conveniently close to the vestry door." Love shifted uneasily. "Do you think Mrs. Hopgood hid it there?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps she meant to remove it later, once everyone had agreed on his guilt." He placed the bag beside the lamp, and the letter, 3 pieces of a puzzle, now forming a quiet accusation. Each object was small, domestic, and polite, and yet together they whispered the shape of a larger deceit. Purbright looked at the clock. "Love, call on Miss Larton first thing in the morning. Tell her not to pack her hymn books quite yet, and send a word to Canon Simper. I'd like a few words before evensong. If conscience has been delayed, we might still catch it before it leaves the platform." Outside, the church bells began again, steady, almost stubborn. Flaxborough's evenings always ended this way, with music too dignified for the town that produced it. Purbright listened from his window, smiling faintly as he poured a final measure of whiskey. "The harvest?" he murmured, glancing at the label on the bicycle. "Yes, I think it's time to see who's been reaping the benefits." The next morning began too quietly for Inspector Purbright's liking. Quiet in Flaxborough never meant peace, it meant someone was busy appearing innocent. The church bells had only just finished their first ring when the telephone on his desk trilled with that particular energy reserved for scandal. Sergeant Love picked it up, his expression stiffening as he listened. "Yes, yes, understood." He covered the receiver. "Sir, that was Constable Keynes. They found something at the canal." Purbright sighed softly. "We were bound to. The canal has been waiting patiently for its share of drama." By the time they arrived, a small crowd had gathered near the towpath bridge, a gathering of umbrellas, disapproval, and curiosity. The constable led them to where the water met a patch of reeds. Something dark and sodden had snagged. Against the bank, a clerical coat, heavy with mud, its collar still stiff, but its contents mercifully absent. Purbright knelt, studying it without touching. Inside the inner pocket, half protected from the water, lay a folded handkerchief embroidered with the initials SF Love drew in a breath. "It's his, sir." "Yes," Purbright said quietly. "And yet it's only the curate's coat we've found. Flaxborough's talent for partial truths continues." He stood, nodding to the constable to have the garment taken for drying and examination. "No sign of a body?" "None, sir," said Keynes, "just the coat and a broken bicycle chain near the edge." "Then either our curate learned to swim astonishingly well," Purbright murmured, "or someone wanted us to believe he had taken a very deliberate dip." The townsfolk's appetite for rumour fattened immediately. By noon, the butcher's boy was telling customers that the curate had been found floating like a sermon on Sunday. By 2, Mrs. Trindle was distributing her personal revelation that she had always known water would be involved. Even the vicar, summoned hastily to identify the coat, looked both relieved and bewildered. It's his, yes. Though I can't think why he'd... He trailed off, conscious of the parishioners clustering in the doorway. Purbright took him aside. Canon, before you despair, let's consider that drowning requires more cooperation than most clergymen can manage. He may have been persuaded to vanish more theatrically than he intended. The vicar blinked. Persuaded? By whom? That, said Purbright, remains to be seen, but we may start with those who benefit from his silence. Back at the station, Purbright examined the dried coat laid across his desk. The lining had torn near the hem, revealing faint watermark letters printed in faded ink. It took him a moment to recognize them. Flaxborough Gazette, 15th March. A newspaper cutting used as makeshift padding, perhaps. He tugged gently, freeing the damp paper. It was an article about the Parish Aid Society's last annual dinner, complete with a photograph of the smiling committee, Mrs. Hopgood prominent at the centre, and the caption beneath, "Funds surpass previous year's total thanks to generous, anonymous benefactor." Anonymous benefactor, Purbright murmured, a role requiring both generosity and discretion. Likely one is real, the other borrowed. Love entered, wiping rain from his hat. "Sir, we've just heard from Granby again. That bicycle ticket bought by the woman in the blue hat? They've found the bicycle she checked in. It's not the curate's. Brand new, hardly used." Purbright smiled faintly. "So Our Lady of Discretion planted a decoy. Either Mrs. Hopgood has a flair for misdirection, or someone is borrowing her wardrobe." The next stop was inevitable. The vicarage looked even more self-consciously respectable than usual, as though it sensed suspicion approaching. Mrs. Hopgood received them in the drawing-room, her composure sharp, enough to cut glass. "Inspector, this is intolerable," she began before he could speak. "You've stirred up gossip that will take months to subdue." "Gossip," said Purbright mildly, "is simply evidence waiting for manners." He held out the newspaper cutting. "You remember this, of course, from last year's Gazette?" Her expression flickered. Naturally, it was a proud occasion. "And the anonymous benefactor, was that yourself, perhaps?" "Certainly not, though I may have facilitated certain donations to ensure propriety." "Propriety often comes at a cost," Purbright said. "I wonder who paid for it?" She stiffened. "If you're implying theft, not theft, adjustment, a tidy balancing of appearances," his voice softened. "You see, the curate's letter suggests he intended to speak to the canon about discrepancies, yet before he could, his coat and bicycle conspired to vanish. That seems an excessive punishment for accounting errors." Her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted a teacup. "You're mistaken." He was, troubled, imaginative. These young men, they take conscience far too seriously. "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "Flaxborough could use more of that particular illness." "When they left," Love whispered, "she's frightened, sir." "She's rehearsing," said Purbright. "Fear comes later." That evening brought a new complication. Constable Keynes appeared with the grim efficiency of a man who wished he hadn't found anything. "Sir, there's been a break-in at the church hall. Someone forced the cupboard behind the stage. Looks like they were searching for something." Purbright glanced up sharply. "The cupboard where the curate's bag was found?" "Yes, sir." "It's gone." "Gone." The missing bag, once retrieved from under the stage, had been locked in the hall for safety. Now it has vanished again. Purbright stood for a long moment, hands clasped behind his back. "We're moving from theft to choreography," he said at last. "Someone is rewriting the curate's story, one prop at a time." Love looked uneasy. "You think it's her again? Mrs. Hopgood?" "Possibly. Or someone tidying up for her. The trouble with righteousness, Love, is that it inspires enthusiastic accomplices." He walked through the rain to the church that night, alone. The nave was dark except for a single lamp burning near the pulpit. He sat in the back pew, listening to the creak of old wood and the faint trickle of water through the guttering. After a while, the door at the far end opened softly. Miss Larton stepped inside, clutching her hymn book like a shield. When she saw him, she hesitated, then approached slowly. "I heard about the coat," she said. "Does it mean he's—" "It means someone wishes us to think so," Purbright replied. "You've been packing, I believe." She flushed. "I thought it best to leave. People talk." "They always do," he said, "but they talk most about those who listen least." "Tell me, Miss Larton, why did you visit the church hall yesterday evening?" Her eyes widened. "How did you do?" "Because whoever took the curate's bag knew where it had been kept. And because you looked relieved when I mentioned it this morning." She looked down at the floor. "I went there to pray," she whispered, "to ask for forgiveness." "For what?" Her answer came so softly that the lamp almost swallowed it. "For knowing more than I said." He waited, patient as ever. "I saw Mrs. Hopgood there that night," she said at last. "The night the bicycle went missing. She was standing by the hedge, near the vestry, with a lantern. I thought she was waiting for someone. I didn't tell anyone I was afraid." Purbright nodded slowly. That was wise. Now it may be time to be unwise. When she left, he remained seated in the dim light, thinking. The curate's bicycle, his coat, the letter, the vanished bag, each had travelled the same small circle around the same determined woman. And yet there was still one piece missing, motive strong enough to risk such delicacy. Outside, the rain deepened, a steady murmur against the church roof. Purbright rose, adjusting his hat, and walked back through the square. The lamps glimmered like modest confessions along the cobbles. Somewhere ahead, the sound of footsteps echoed faintly, a rhythm too cautious to be casual. He smiled in the darkness. At last, he murmured, the second incident had arrived on time. Inspector Purbright never liked coincidences that arrived politely at his doorstep. They usually carried guilt in borrowed shoes. The night's quiet footsteps outside the church had belonged to something more deliberate than chance. When he stepped into the street, the sound had vanished, leaving only the scent of wet stone and a faint ripple in the puddles where someone had turned too quickly. He followed the trail toward the vicarage, his umbrella angled low, every sense attuned to the subtle hush of a town holding its breath. By the time he reached the gates, the vicarage windows were dark except for one pale rectangle of light on the upper floor. It flickered once, then vanished. He waited a moment longer, listening, before retreating down the path. There was no need to startle anyone. Fear was most revealing when it thought itself unseen. The following morning, Purbright sat at his desk, reviewing the pieces of the puzzle that now formed something resembling a conscience. The curate's resignation letter, the missing bag, the coat in the canal, the tidy arithmetic of false accounts, and the too careful calm of Mrs. Hopgood. He stirred his tea absently, then set it aside cold again. He often wondered why truth, once brewed, always cooled so quickly in human hands. Sergeant Love entered with fresh information and the smell of rain still clinging to his coat. "Morning, sir." "You were right about the footsteps. Constable Keynes says he saw someone leaving the church lane around midnight. Said it was a tall man in a raincoat carrying a lantern." Purbright looked up. "Not Mrs. Hopgood, then? Unless she's been improving her disguise. Could it have been the canon?" Purbright leaned back in thought. Possibly. Or someone tidying away what she couldn't. Guilt has a way of recruiting help, Love, often from the very people most shocked by its existence. Love frowned. You think the vicar's involved? I think the vicar believes that cleanliness and silence are the same thing. Unfortunately, the first requires effort, and the second merely omission. He rose and walked to the window. Outside, Flaxborough looked deceptively wholesome in the late morning sun, the kind of town that would cheerfully plant flowers over its scandals. He thought of Miss Larton, frightened but honest, and of the curate, earnest to the point of foolishness. People like them were useful to the world only until their virtue became inconvenient. After that, society preferred them mislaid. At noon, Purbright went to the church alone. Inside, the air held the faint sweetness of candle wax and damp hymnals. The organist's music drifted faintly from the loft, a cautious scale that suggested guilt rather than worship. Purbright moved quietly toward the vestry. The cupboard behind the door, where the curate's satchel had once been hidden, stood slightly ajar again. He crouched to inspect it, finding a faint footprint on the polished floor, muddy but not fresh. The sole's pattern was sharp and rectangular, a man's boot, not a woman's shoe. He smiled faintly and rose. When he emerged into the nave, Canon Simper was there, pale and breathless, as though he had hurried from prayer into trouble. "Inspector, you startled me." "Unintentional, I assure you," Purbright replied mildly. "Late-night visits to the church seem to be in fashion. I thought I'd join the congregation." The vicar gave a nervous laugh. "You mean Mrs. Hopgood's fuss?" Yes, dreadful thing about poor Felsham. But really, Inspector, must we prolong this? The diocese will wish it was handled discreetly." "Discretion," Purbright said softly, "is the Church's most reliable sacrament." The vicar's eyes flickered. "I beg your pardon?" Purbright's tone remained polite. "Tell me, Canon, how long have the parish aid accounts been short of their expected sum?" The silence that followed was brief but eloquent. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Come now," Purbright said. "You strike me as a man too precise to misplace decimal points. I've seen your ledgers. They speak of arithmetic performed under pressure, and perhaps persuasion." The canon sank onto a pew, head in his hands. "It wasn't theft," he whispered. "It was reallocated. The funds went to pay for repairs, roof leaks, heating, parish upkeep. I only meant to adjust the records later. But Simon found out. He said it was deceit." "And you told your wife," Purbright said quietly. "And she decided to protect you." The man's face reddened. "You can't prove that." "No," Purbright said, "but she already has. Every tidy lie bears her signature: blue hats, bicycle tickets, misplaced sympathy. You need only remain silent, and she'll go on saving your soul until it drowns." He left the canon sitting there, motionless among the pews. Outside, the day had turned restless. Clouds pressed low, the air charged with coming rain. As Purbright crossed the churchyard, he saw Miss Larton approaching, her eyes anxious. She carried a small envelope. "I found this," she said, handing it to him. "It was pushed through my letterbox last night." Inside, folded neatly, was a page torn from the parish aid report, the missing donations list. Several names had been altered by hand, one crossed out entirely. Simon Felsham. Next to it, in a different ink, someone had written simply, "Not forgotten." Purbright slipped it into his pocket. "He's alive," he said, almost to himself. Miss Larton's eyes widened. "Then he didn't." "No, he's been kept away, not taken away. I think Mrs. Hopgood arranged for him to be, persuaded to leave quietly, possibly sent to stay with one of the diocesan missions until the dust settled." "But why do they coat the canal to complete the illusion?" Purbright said. "Flaxborough loves neat endings. She provided one." He thanked her and sent her home, then returned to the station where Love waited. "Love," he said, "will need to send inquiries to the diocesan office. Check recent transfers of curates to missions north of Granby. Use the name Felsham, but also any variation aliases are the church's second most common miracle. The sergeant nodded and hurried off. Left alone, Purbright poured himself another cup of tea and sat back, eyes half closed. Cases like this always left him reflective. Crimes of greed or violence were straightforward enough. They stank of motive. But crimes of virtue, the kind committed in defense of reputation, were subtler and more aromatic. They perfumed themselves in good intentions until the whole room smelled of sanctity and deceit combined. He thought of Mrs. Hopgood, standing so confidently in her drawing-room, hands folded like a saint in a stained glass window. There was an undeniable artistry to her manipulation, a devotion that almost earned admiration. She had not acted from malice, merely from certainty that she was right. That, Purbright reflected, was the most dangerous motive of all. The light outside dimmed to the colour of pewter. From the church, faint bells drifted again, soft and distant. Purbright watched the ripples of their sound fade through the window glass, wondering not for the first time why good people committed small dishonesties to protect their belief in goodness. Perhaps, he thought, virtue was simply the most elegant disguise of fear. He took out the curate's letter once more and read the closing line conscience, leaving no room for delay. Then he smiled a little sadly and murmured, "No, my dear Felsham, but Flaxborough always does." The door opened and Love returned, rain spattering his notebook. "Sir, we've got confirmation. A Reverend S. Field was assigned to the Granby mission 2 days ago. No such clergyman before that date." "Field," Purbright repeated. "Yes, that's Felsham enough for paperwork." He rose, taking his hat. "Pack your raincoat, love. We're going to Granby tomorrow. I believe our missing curate is waiting to confess to someone who won't interrupt him." As he extinguished the lamp, the office fell into shadow, its quiet filled only by the faint ticking of the clock and the unhurried turning of wheels, slow, steady, inevitable, as though the town itself were pedalling toward the truth. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love arrived in Granby under a thin, reluctant sun. The small market town resembled Flaxborough, in the way cousins resemble each other when both prefer not to acknowledge it. Here, too, the shopkeepers were half hidden behind lace curtains, and the church spire watched the streets with moral curiosity. The diocesan mission stood on the edge of town, a grey stone house with peeling white paint and the smell of weak tea and discipline. A matronly woman in a dark cardigan met them at the door. "You'll be the gentleman from Flaxborough," she said, in a tone that suggested she approved of neither gentleman nor Flaxborough. "The Reverend Field is resting after his morning devotions." Purbright inclined his head. "We shan't disturb his sanctity for long. The Lord and I have a mutual interest in unfinished business." She pursed her lips and led them down a narrow corridor to a room smelling faintly of polish and melancholy. Inside, seated at a desk cluttered with parish bulletins, was a man thinner than memory, but unmistakably the missing curate. He rose, eyes widening first in surprise, then in something like relief. "Inspector," he said quietly, "I rather thought you'd come." "I usually do, Mr. Felsham, or should I say Reverend Field?" Purbright gestured toward the chair. "Do sit. I find conversation less formal when no one's attempting to flee." Felsham obeyed. His hands, resting on the desk, trembled slightly. "You've spoken to them, then?" "To nearly everyone," Purbright replied. "And they've all been most obliging in their variously guilty ways. You, however, seem to have done the vanishing part with unusual thoroughness. Care to explain why your coat decided to swim without you?" The curate gave a faint, helpless smile. "That was her idea, of course. She said it would protect everyone." "Mrs. Hopgood?" He nodded. "She told me I'd made a terrible mistake. That if I went to the canon, it would ruin him and the parish. and my own future. She said the only way to repair the damage was to disappear for a while, to let things settle. The diocese would place me elsewhere quietly. She even arranged the transfer herself. Purbright studied him for a long moment. So you agreed? I thought it was mercy, Felsham said, voice thin with regret. She spoke so kindly and said she'd handle everything. The bicycle, the coat, even my resignation note. I didn't know she'd make it look like that. He broke off, glancing toward the window where light slanted through dust. I only meant to spare embarrassment, but when I saw the papers, when I realized she'd staged it as a disappearance, I understood. She wasn't saving me, she was preserving them. Indeed, Purbright said. Flaxborough is a fine museum for preserved reputations. He leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Mr. Felsham, what exactly did you discover in those accounts? The curate hesitated, then opened a drawer and drew out a folded sheet of paper. These are copies of the letters. They show that parish donations were redirected through a separate account, one managed jointly by the Canon and Mrs. Hopgood. The money wasn't stolen, not entirely, but several large ones vanished into consultancy fees. She said it was standard practice. Purbright scanned the page briefly before tucking it into his coat. Standard practice, yes. In Flaxborough, deceit is often mistaken for administration. The curate's composure wavered. What will happen now? That depends on whether you intend to return and tell the truth, Purbright said. If you stay silent, she'll go on running the parish as a moral theatre. If you speak, she'll try to play martyr. Either way, the audience grows weary eventually. Felsham bowed his head. I never wanted harm, only honesty. Honesty, said Purbright softly, is harm in polite clothing, but it does fit better over time. They left him to his conscience and drove back through the lanes toward Flaxborough. The landscape rolled past, fields fading into mist, hedgerows keeping their secrets. Love broke the silence first. He's not a bad sort, sir, just weak. Indeed, Purbright said, and weakness is the currency of the righteous. They spend it freely, then complain of poverty. They reached the town by late afternoon. The first thing Purbright noticed was the subdued air outside the church gates. A small group had gathered Mrs. Trindle, the organist, and 2 or 3 of the more curious widows, all whispering in tones that carried perfectly to his ears. Something's happened at the vicarage, Love murmured. Purbright walked ahead, his expression unreadable. Inside, the house smelled of lavender polish and alarm. Canon Simper met them in the hall, pale and shaking. Inspector, it's dreadful. She's taken ill by my wife. A collapse of nerves, the doctor says. He's upstairs now. May I see her? The canon hesitated, then nodded. Please, perhaps you can make her understand. Mrs. Hopgood lay propped against white pillows, still formidable even in distress. Her eyes fixed on Purbright as he entered. You've been to Granby, she said. You've spoken to him. Yes, Purbright replied. He's alive, well and regrettably honest. She looked away, the corners of her mouth tightening. Then you've undone everything. I've corrected it, he said evenly. The truth rarely ruins anyone who deserves to be saved. You don't understand, she whispered. The parish would have fallen apart. The canon couldn't bear the disgrace. I only wished to keep order. Purbright regarded her gently. Order, Mrs. Hopgood, is the first refuge of those afraid of consequence. You tried to tidy the world by sweeping people under it. Tears welled, though pride kept them from falling. I did it for him. And in doing so, Purbright said, you left him no one to confess to. The doctor entered then, murmuring about rest and sedatives. Purbright stepped back, watching as her eyes closed not in repentance, but in exhaustion. When they left the vicarage, evening had settled again. The church bell rang 6 times, slow and resonant. Love spoke softly as they walked toward the station. "What happens to her, sir?" "She'll recover. The diocese will send someone to investigate. The canon will retain his pulpit, though perhaps not his peace. The curate will be reassigned, with fewer illusions. And the town," Purbright added, "will carry on as if none of it happened. Flaxborough's most enduring miracle is forgetfulness." They crossed the market square, the lamps flickering on one by one, casting pale halos over puddles. Purbright paused, watching the reflections ripple. "There's one more thing to do, love. Tomorrow morning we'll hold a little gathering at the church hall. A few polite questions, a misplaced receipt or two. I want to see how the canon and his wife manage the truth when the audience has returned." Love smiled faintly. "Your test, sir?" "Precisely," Purbright said. "The performance of innocence is best observed in public." The next morning he arranged for the principal parish committee to meet under the pretext of revising the Harvest Festival programme. Mrs. Hopgood, pale but upright, sat at one end of the table. Canon Simper beside her, fingers twitching against his hymn book. Purbright stood near the window watching the sunlight slide across the bicycles parked outside. One of them, polished, upright, and newly chained, was the curate's, returned anonymously that dawn. He cleared his throat. "Before we begin, I've been asked to inquire about some missing correspondence from last year's aid report. I imagine it's simply been misplaced." Mrs. Hopgood's expression did not change, but the canon's colour drained. "Inspector, surely this isn't necessary." "It's only a formality," Purbright said pleasantly. "Just as your wife's little trip to Granby was, I assume." The room froze. Only the ticking of the wall clock broke the silence. Mrs. Hopgood's composure cracked, ever so slightly. "I did what I thought was right," she said, her voice steady but faint. "If that is a crime, then perhaps righteousness itself is guilty." "Indeed," Purbright said, "and I'm here merely to record its confession." He left them then, the church bell ringing faintly through the open window, a sound neither accusatory nor forgiving, merely final. Outside he paused beside the curate's bicycle, its chain gleaming in the sun. With a small smile, he touched the handlebars as though acknowledging an old accomplice. "Every sermon needs a text, love," he murmured. "Ours, I think, was written on 2 wheels. The sergeant nodded, smiling in quiet understanding as they walked away, the town resuming its normal, respectable hum. Somewhere behind them, the bell struck 7, each chime folding into the calm of a community once more at ease with itself, blissfully certain that virtue and deceit could coexist without friction as long as they were properly arranged. The following morning brought a thin, undecided light to Flaxborough, one of those mornings that seemed to have no opinion about the weather, or anything else for that matter. The market square stirred quietly, pretending indifference to the whispers still circling about the curate's miraculous return to the realm of the living. Inside the police station, Inspector Purbright sat by the window with an air of contented fatigue, as though the case had already confessed itself, but was still composing a sermon about it. Sergeant Love arrived with the latest correspondence from the diocesan office. "They've confirmed, sir, that Mrs. Hopgood personally requested the transfer of Reverend Felsham under the alias Field. She even wrote the covering letter saying he was suffering from vocational fatigue and required discretion. The canon's signature was appended later." Purbright nodded. "Yes, appended, that's a gentle diocesan euphemism for obtained by marital insistence. It seems she was running the parish accounts and the canon simultaneously, with equal efficiency." Love looked puzzled. "What do we do now, sir?" "Arrest her?" "Hardly. She's ill, remember. And besides, we've no statute against moral hygiene, which is the only crime she's committed so far. What we can do is invite the parish committee to hear a few words from our curate before everyone forgets why he disappeared." The invitation went out quietly through the proper channels: Canon Simper's secretary, the vicarage maid, and, of course, Mrs. Trindle, who could distribute a rumour faster than any official notice. By late afternoon, the church hall was full again: parish elders, flower arrangers, choir members, and the mildly indignant general public. At the far end, on the small platform usually reserved for recitals, sat Purbright, the canon, and a visibly uneasy Reverend Felsham. Beside the tea-urn, Mrs. Hopgood presided, immaculate in pale grey, her composure restored to ceremonial precision. Purbright opened proceedings in his usual mild voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered to clarify a few misunderstandings concerning the temporary absence of Reverend Felsham and certain irregularities in parish finances. The two matters, I am afraid, are connected not by sin, but by misunderstanding, which in Flaxborough is nearly as fatal." A low murmur stirred among the audience. The vicar cleared his throat, but Purbright continued gently. "You will recall that the curate's bicycle was reported missing some days ago, followed by his sudden disappearance. I am happy to report that both have been recovered, though in differing conditions. The bicycle is once again at the church gate, freshly polished. The curate, rather less polished, has returned from an involuntary holiday in Granby." A polite ripple of laughter passed through the hall, quickly suppressed. Purbright went on, his tone as dry as an old psalm. "Our investigation has revealed that Reverend Felsham's absence was not the result of guilt, but of obedience. He was persuaded, under the noblest intentions, of course, that his silence would protect the parish. The persuasion was, I should add, delivered with eloquence and considerable force." He turned slightly toward Mrs. Hopgood, whose expression did not flicker. "The parish funds, as some of you may have noticed, were rearranged over the past year. A portion was redirected to cover legitimate expenses, but without proper accounting. When the curate discovered this, he planned to report it. Certain persons again, acting from piety rather than malice, believed the wiser course was to let him vanish until the ledgers could be harmonized." The canon shifted uneasily. "Inspector, must we—" "Yes, Canon, we must," Purbright said pleasantly. "I assure you the Almighty will forgive our clarity." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the copy of the curate's letter, unfolding it carefully. "This, written by Reverend Felsham before his disappearance, speaks not of scandal, but of conscience." It was addressed to Mrs. Hopgood, who chose not to deliver it to you. Instead, she arranged his reassignment, purchased a false railway ticket, and donated his coat to the canal, all to spare your embarrassment. Gasps circled the room like startled birds. Mrs. Hopgood's eyes remained on the floor, her lips pressed into a prayer that had lost its words. The canon looked as if his collar had grown 2 sizes too small. "My dear," he began weakly. "You never told me I told you enough," she said quietly. "You weren't strong enough to do what was necessary." Purbright folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket. "That, I think, is the essence of our little drama. No villainy, only excess virtue. The curate was too truthful, the canon too trusting, and Mrs. Hopgood too efficient. A perfect triangle of good intentions, each point pricking the other. The silence that followed was long and oddly peaceful. Flaxborough had a deep respect for public confession, provided it was someone else's. After a moment, Mrs. Hopgood stood. "If I've sinned," she said calmly, "it was in loyalty. I shall speak to the bishop myself." Purbright inclined his head. That would be most convenient. The bishop will appreciate the efficiency. When she left the hall, the canon followed, his face pale with a mixture of shame and relief. The parish committee sat bewildered, like an audience uncertain whether the curtain had just fallen or merely fluttered. Miss Larton, sitting near the back, dabbed her eyes, though from joy or fatigue even she could not tell. Purbright waited until the room began to stir, then rose once more. Before we close, I would remind you that the curate's bicycle, like virtue, has returned somewhat worse for wear, but still serviceable. It might do us all good to remember that restoration is not achieved by polish alone, but by the will to keep pedalling in the right direction. The remark earned a small wave of laughter, and the tension dissolved as people began to file out into the damp evening. Purbright lingered by the door, exchanging polite nods and listening to the town reassemble, its sense of moral order. Love appeared beside him, notebook in hand. "So that's that, sir." "For now," Purbright said. "The diocese will do its tidy version with no headlines, no scandal. The Hopgoods will take a sabbatical for health reasons, and Reverend Felsham will be reassigned again, perhaps somewhere that appreciates martyrdom in moderation. And us, sir? We'll return to vandalized park benches and runaway cats," Purbright said. "The world's smaller crimes are always grateful for attention after moral melodrama." As they stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and newly disturbed soil. Across the square, the curate stood by his bicycle, adjusting the chain with cautious reverence. When he saw Purbright, he straightened. "I wanted to thank you, Inspector. You've been kinder than I deserve." Purbright smiled faintly. "I doubt that, but do try not to misplace this one again. Heaven might not provide a second." The curate laughed softly, pushing the bicycle toward the rectory. The bell gave a small, uncertain ring, like a confession interrupted halfway through, and then he was gone around the corner. Purbright watched until the sound faded. "Funny thing, love," he said quietly. "In Flaxborough, truth never rides alone. It always carries someone on the crossbar." Love frowned. "Doesn't sound comfortable, sir." "It isn't," said Purbright. "That's what keeps it honest." They walked on together past the shuttered shops and the flickering lamplight, the town settling once more into its gentle rhythm of gossip, forgiveness, and selective memory. Somewhere behind them the church clock chimed 9, each strike folding into the night like a calm acknowledgement that everything, sin, virtue, and bicycles alike, had found their proper places once more. By the end of the week, Flaxborough had decided to forgive itself. It was something the town did habitually, with a grace born of long practice. The curate's disappearance had transformed from scandal to anecdote, the missing bicycle from mystery to metaphor. At the post office, Mrs. Chubb now referred to the whole affair as a lesson in Christian patience, while Mrs. Trindle insisted she had known from the start it wasn't really about a bicycle. In Flaxborough, once gossip had exhausted its moral energy, it turned reflective. Inspector Purbright, however, had not yet relaxed. He believed in tidy conclusions only after the ink had dried. On Friday morning, he walked through the churchyard beneath a pale lemon sky. The autumn leaves were gathering in slow heaps against the gravestones, and from somewhere nearby came the faint sound of a broom and a hymn whistled out of tune. He found the curate there, sweeping the path with the same conscientiousness that had nearly cost him his vocation. "Morning," Reverend Purbright said. Felsham straightened, slightly flushed from the effort. "Inspector, I was hoping to see you. The canon's asked me to stay on until my transfer is confirmed. He says the parish needs stability." "Ah," Purbright said mildly. "Stability, Flaxborough's favourite illusion. I trust the parish is behaving itself." "For now," Felsham said with a wry smile. "People nod kindly, but I can feel the distance." They're polite, not forgiving. I suppose they need a few more sermons before they decide which sins to overlook. Purbright smiled faintly. Time will take care of that. It always does here. It's our local saint. He looked around at the quiet graves. How's Mrs. Hopgood? Recovering, Felsham replied. She sent a message yesterday. Asked if I could forgive her. I said I already had. Of course you did, said Purbright softly. That's what makes you so inconvenient to people like her. They stood in silence for a moment, the broom rasping gently against the stone path. Finally, Felsham said, I keep wondering if I should have done things differently. If I'd spoken sooner or not at all. Purbright's gaze wandered to the church door, its hinges old but steadfast. Conscience is rather like that door, he said. It sticks when you most need it to open, and swings wide when you least expect company. The important thing is not to nail it shut. The curate laughed quietly, though it sounded more like relief than amusement. You speak almost like a preacher yourself, Inspector. Only of human frailty, Purbright replied, a subject I'm quite familiar with. He left the curate to his sweeping and crossed the square toward the police station. The town moved around him in its ordinary, contented rhythm, the butcher's cart rattling over cobbles, the faint clatter of a tea tray in the window above the chemist's, the world tidying itself back into habit. Sergeant Love was waiting at his desk, the day's papers spread before him. Morning, sir. There's a letter from the bishop's office. They've accepted Mrs. Hopgood's resignation from all diocesan duties on grounds of health. The canon's taking a short leave as well. Good, Purbright said, taking off his hat. Flaxborough can manage without sanctity for a few weeks. It's always been self-regulating. Love hesitated. You think she'll be punished, sir? Not officially, Purbright said. The Church prefers its retribution mild and its embarrassment private. She'll retire somewhere damp and quiet, live surrounded by framed certificates of good service, and convince herself that she saved everyone. In time, she'll half believe it. That's her punishment and her comfort. Love nodded slowly, digesting this. And the curate? He'll be sent somewhere smaller, I imagine. A parish where people gossip less and pray more. He'll start again, perhaps wiser, perhaps only lonelier. He sat back, lighting his pipe. Still, I rather admire him. He was too good for Flaxborough, which is to say, just good enough to make it nervous. For a while, they worked in a companionable quiet. Then Love, glancing toward the window, said, You know, sir, there's one thing that still bothers me. Why the note on the bicycle for the harvest? No one ever explained that. Purbright exhaled a thin stream of smoke, eyes half closed. Ah, that, my guess. Mrs. Hopgood left it as a kind of moral flourish. She thought the whole affair a parable. The bicycle was to symbolize the curate's sacrifice his reputation offered up for the greater good. In her mind, it was almost liturgical. Then she really believed she was doing right. Oh, undoubtedly. The most dangerous crimes in Flaxborough are always committed by people convinced they're saving someone else's soul. They both laughed quietly, though the sound carried a hint of melancholy. Outside, a church bell rang for midday prayers, slow and deliberate. Purbright listened, tapping his pipe thoughtfully against the edge of the desk. Do you know what real pity is, love? Every time righteousness and fear shake hands, someone ends up drowning in the canal? The sergeant grimaced. Not a very cheerful observation, sir. Cheerfulness, Purbright said, is rarely found near truth, but one must live with both. Later that afternoon, he walked once more through the market square. The air had softened, a light drizzle settled over the cobbles like a benediction. Near the fountain, Miss Larton was arranging flowers into a basket of marigolds and white lilies, bright and incongruously cheerful. She greeted him shyly. "Inspector, I was just taking these to the church. They've asked me to help with the altar. until Reverend Felsham leaves. A sensible choice, he said. You'll keep the place human. She smiled. It feels different there now, quieter somehow, as if it's breathing again. Purbright nodded. Churches, like people, prefer honesty to reverence. Honesty creaks less at night. She laughed softly, though her eyes shone. He told me he's going to Derbyshire. I'll miss him. I dare say he'll miss you too, Purbright said gently, though perhaps that's the first blessing he's earned without supervision. When she had gone, he stood for a moment watching the square. The rain deepened to a fine, steady curtain. Flaxborough looked newly washed, its sins, secrets, and small decencies all blending into the damp glow of civility. It was, he thought, a town perfectly suited to its people. Incapable of great evil, equally incapable of great change. As he turned toward home, his shoes making slow, contented sounds against the wet pavement, he caught sight of the curate again. Felsham was cycling across the square, upright and cautious, the bell chiming once as if in greeting. The sight made Purbright smile. There was something reassuring about it, a symbol restored, however ordinary. "See, love," he murmured to himself, "nothing in Flaxborough ever truly disappears. It just waits for forgiveness to catch up." The bicycle rounded the corner and was gone. The town resumed its gentle rhythm, the murmur of conversation, the hush of rain, and the unhurried toll of the church bell fading into evening. Purbright paused at the end of the lane, glancing back once more toward St. Botolph's steeple. Then he straightened his hat, tucked his hands in his pockets, and walked on through the drizzle, thinking, as he often did, that human virtue was rather like the curate's old bicycle, slow, squeaky, occasionally misdirected, yet somehow still capable of getting one home. And as the lamps flickered to life across the square, the faint gleam of their reflections on the wet cobbles seemed to him a modest benediction, a reminder that even in Flaxborough, where secrets rust as quietly as bicycles, decency never quite loses its balance.